Loudoun Hill, the hill that made Scotland. Blood, fire, witchcraft, and the eternal watch. Welcome to Quietly Reflective. Tonight we travel to East Ayrshire, to a place where stone, story, and silence have stood together for longer than memory can properly hold. Loudoun Hill is not just a landmark on the road between Ayrshire and the Clyde Valley. It is a witness, a dark shape above the moor, a place where Scotland's history, folklore, fear, faith, and resistance seem to gather in the same breath. So settle yourself wherever you are. Let the day loosen its hold. And as the wind moves across the open ground, come with me to the foot of the hill that stands alone. This is Loudoun Hill, the hill that made Scotland. Chapter 1. Born of Fire, the Making of the Hill. To understand Loudoun Hill, you must first understand that it is not simply a hill. It is an event, a violence preserved in stone. Long before Scotland had anything like its present shape, long before Ayrshire had a name, long before the River Irvine cut its way through the valley, long before any human eye could look up and wonder at the sudden dark shape rising from the moor, fire was moving beneath the ground. Not the fire of a hearth, not the brief, bright fire of wood or candle or lightning. Something older, slower, less forgiving. Molten rock, held under pressure in the deep places of the earth, found weaknesses above it and forced itself upward. It pushed into cracks and beds and hidden spaces, intruding through the softer rocks that surrounded it. It did not need to hurry. Geological violence has patience. It can take longer than whole civilizations and still be violent. The rock cooled, hardened, waited. Then time began its longer work. Rain fell, wind crossed the land, rivers found their channels, ice came and went. The softer ground around the volcanic rock wore away, grain by grain, season by season, age by age. What remained was harder, more stubborn, less willing to disappear. And so Loudoun Hill was left standing. Not built upward like a monument, though it feels like one. Not placed there by hand, though it looks almost intentional. But revealed, uncovered by the slow removal of everything weaker around it. That is part of its power. Some places are impressive because they were made. Loudoun Hill is impressive because it endured. During the last great ice age, this landscape was not moorland. It was not road and river and field. It was buried beneath ice of a scale that is difficult to imagine properly. Sheets of ice moved across Scotland with grinding, almost mindless force, pressing down on the land, carving, scraping, smoothing, dragging stone across stone with a patience that no living creature could comprehend. The ice altered everything. It shaped valleys, it scattered boulders, it left deposits of gravel and clay. It pushed and planed and remade the land. But Loudoun Hill remained. The ice could scour it, weather it, round its edges, expose its hardness, but it could not erase it. When the ice finally retreated, roughly 12,000 years ago, it left behind a raw and newly opened world. Cold ground, wet hollows, bare stone, thin soils, meltwater running in new channels, a landscape slowly beginning to breathe again. The first plants returned, mosses, grasses, heather, the beginnings of peat. Animals followed the greening land. Birds moved across the open spaces. Deer found the valleys. Water gathered and moved. The river began to know itself, and eventually human beings came. Not as armies, not as kings, not as farmers at first, but as small groups moving through a difficult landscape, reading the ground as carefully as we now read words. They would have known the meaning of shelter, water, height, visibility, danger. They would have understood, instantly and practically, that a place like Loudoun Hill mattered, because the hill gave you sight, and sight, in the old world, was life. From the slopes of Loudoun Hill, you could see movement across the moor. You could watch the valley. You could judge weather by the way it approached from the west. You could see smoke, people, animals, strangers, threat. To stand higher than the land around you was not only symbolic, it was useful. And yet, it is hard to believe that usefulness explains everything. Because there are many useful places. There are many rises of ground, many defensive slopes, many places where a watchman could stand and look for danger. But Loudoun Hill is different. It has that quality some places have, where practical advantage and something harder to name seem to meet. A place where the human mind says, yes, this is good ground. And some older part of the mind says, no, this is more than that. This matters. The moorland around the hill is wet and uneven. Peaty ground holds water long after rain has passed. Grass grows in clumps and tussocks. There are places where a careless foot sinks deeper than expected. Places where the surface looks firm until it is asked to bear weight. This matters too. Because Loudoun Hill is not only a rock. It is a rock in relation to wet ground. A height in relation to a road. A landmark in relation to movement. A hard place above soft places. That relationship shaped history. Again and again, the people who understood Loudoun Hill understood not just the hill itself, but the land around it. They understood where a horse could pass and where it could not, where a body of men could spread out and where it would be narrowed, where the ground would hold and where it would betray. The hill did not fight Scotland's battles, but it made certain battles possible. It narrowed choices. It channeled movement. It forced men to approach in particular ways. It turned geography into strategy. Long before Wallace, long before Bruce, long before Claverhouse and the Covenanters, the hill was already teaching the same lesson. The ground is never neutral. 4 seconds. On a grey day, which is many days in East Ayrshire, the hill can seem almost severe. The sky lowers. The wind moves over the open ground. The colours reduce themselves to peat brown, grass green, stone dark, cloud grey. There is no softness in it then, no romance, only exposure. You can imagine why people feared this kind of place, not because it was evil, not because it was cursed, but because it reminded them how little shelter the world truly offers. Then, on another day, the light changes, the clouds open, the slope catches sun, the volcanic rock seems to sharpen against the sky. The same hill becomes magnificent, not gentle, never gentle, but clear, commanding, alive in the way old stone can seem alive when light and shadow move across it. This is part of the difficulty of Loudoun Hill. It is not one thing. It is beautiful and bleak, practical and sacred, historic and prehistoric, a landmark for drivers and walkers, and a place where the dead seem closer than they ought to be. It stands beside an ordinary road, yet it does not feel ordinary. It belongs to maps, but not only to maps. It belongs to history, but not only to history. It belongs to geology, folklore, memory, weather, and silence. And perhaps that is why each age has found a different use for it. The Iron Age saw a place to defend. Rome saw a route to control. Wallace's story found a place to resist. Bruce found a battlefield. The witch trials found a hill fit for fear. The Covenanters found open ground where conscience could be spoken aloud. The dispossessed found, perhaps, the last fixed shape in a landscape changing beyond their control. And we, coming late to all of this, find a hill that has already outlasted every explanation we have given it. That is the first truth of Loudoun Hill. Before it was history, it was stone. Before it was Scotland, it was fire. Before anyone gave it a name, it stood in the path of weather and time, enduring what softer things could not. And when the people came, they did what people have always done in the presence of places that feel larger than themselves. They looked up. They listened. And slowly, carefully, fearfully, they began to tell stories. Chapter 2. The First Watchers, Forts, Roads, and Rome. The first people to recognise Loudoun Hill's strategic value and do something systematic with it were the Iron Age communities who inhabited this part of Scotland in the centuries before Rome arrived. We should not imagine them as shadows. They were not vague figures moving at the edge of history, waiting for someone else to write them down. They were people with children, cattle, tools, fears, loyalties, rituals, disputes, and memories. They knew the weather of this valley with an intimacy most of us have lost. They knew which burns rose quickly after rain. They knew where the ground was safe and where it softened treacherously beneath a foot. They knew the routes taken by animals, travellers, raiders, and strangers. They built with that knowledge. On the slopes of Loudoun Hill, traces of ancient settlement and defence still hold to the ground. Ditches, banks, earthworks reduced by time, softened by weather, but not erased. Enough remains for archaeologists to mark and measure, and enough remains for the imagination to do its quieter work. Stand there today and try to remove everything modern. Take away the road, take away the fences, take away the passing engines, the distant farm machinery, the overhead wires, the signs, the mapped certainty of the present. Leave only the hill. Leave the wet ground below it. Leave the sky moving above it. Leave the river finding its path through the valley. Leave the settlement on the slope, with smoke lifting from roundhouses and dogs moving between the doors, and someone standing watch because someone always had to stand watch. Then you begin to understand. The hill gave warning. From its slopes, an approaching group could be seen long before it arrived. A line of movement on the road, a scatter of birds rising, a darker mark crossing the open land. Warning gave time. Time gave choices. Choices gave life. In the Iron Age, control of movement mattered deeply. Whoever understood the roads and passes understood not simply travel, but power. Cattle could be driven along those routes, goods could be carried, messages could pass, enemies could come. The valley below Loudoun Hill was not empty space, it was a corridor, and corridors are watched. Then Rome came. Not all at once, not in one dramatic moment that everyone present would have understood as history changing shape. Rome came as roads, forts, patrols, orders, ditches, discipline, ironwork, coinage, and command. Rome came with the strange insistence that land could be brought under a system, that movement could be regulated, that a valley could be turned into a line on a military map. Near a lantern beg, in the shadow of Loudoun Hill, Roman military remains have been recorded. Whether we imagine a small fort, a temporary enclosure, or a guarded point in a wider military network, the meaning is clear enough. Rome noticed this place. Of course it did. Rome noticed roads. Rome noticed high ground. Rome noticed places from which movement could be controlled. The soldiers who moved through this valley were far from the heart of their empire. Some may have come from other parts of Britain, others may have come from Gaul, Spain, the Rhineland, or places whose names they themselves might never have expected to leave. They would have marched through weather that had no respect for empire. They would have looked at the dark mass of Loudoun Hill above the road and perhaps understood in their own way that they were not the first people to feel watched here. Roman soldiers were practical about religion. They carried their gods with them, but they were also willing to acknowledge local powers. In strange country, among people whose language and customs were not their own, it was wise to keep supernatural options open. Perhaps a soldier standing guard near the road at 3 a.m. looked up at the hill and silently offered something. A coin, a word, a promise, a private fear. Perhaps not. History does not give us that detail, but it gives us enough. It gives us the road. It gives us the military trace. It gives us the hill. It gives us the knowledge that long before Wallace and Bruce, long before Covenanters and witch trials, the valley below Loudoun Hill was already part of a contest over movement, power, control, and fear. There is a line that runs through this whole story. Sometimes it is a road, sometimes a track, sometimes a marching route, sometimes a path taken by people who do not want to be seen. But it is always there, and Loudoun Hill stands above it, watching who passes, watching who returns, watching who does not. The people of the Iron Age did not vanish when Rome arrived. They adapted, resisted, traded, withdrew, negotiated, survived. The land continued to be worked, fires continued to be lit, children continued to be born beneath the shape of the hill. The Roman presence came and went, as imperial presences always do. Roads remained longer than orders. Place names remained longer than commanders. The hill remained longer than everything. That is one of the lessons Loudoun Hill teaches again and again. Power arrives loudly. It builds, it commands, it names, it punishes. It believes itself permanent. Then, eventually, it leaves. The hill stays, and the people who come after build their own stories on the old ground, not always knowing whose footsteps they are standing in. Chapter 3. Wallace, the ambush in the gully. By the end of the 13th century, Scotland was in agony. The death of Alexander III, the crisis of succession, the intervention of Edward I of England, the humiliating reduction of King John Balliol, the submission of much of the Scottish nobility, all of it had left the kingdom wounded and uncertain. Scotland was not yet broken, but it had been made to feel breakable. Edward understood power as something to be demonstrated. He understood humiliation as a weapon. He understood that if the symbols of kingship could be stripped away, if oaths could be forced, if great lords could be made to bend publicly, then a country might begin to doubt itself. For a while, many did bend. Some out of calculation, some out of fear. Some because they believed resistance was impossible. Some because they had estates, families, hostages, futures, and the practical instincts of survival. But not everyone. In the southwest, a name began to move through the trees and roads and farmsteads like weather. William Wallace. Not a king, not a great magnate, not a man whose authority came from a crown or a parliament or a long line of titled ancestors. A man of lesser nobility, remembered as unusually tall, forceful, violent when violence was required, and possessed of the kind of will that unsettles both enemies and allies. The difficulty with Wallace is that the man and the legend are almost impossible to separate. The most famous narrative of his early life comes from Blind Harry, writing nearly 2 centuries later, drawing on oral tradition, patriotic memory, performance, imagination, and perhaps fragments of truth that had survived in households and local places long after documents had failed. We should be careful. Careful does not mean dismissive. A legend can be historically uncertain and still be culturally powerful. Sometimes legend preserves the emotional truth of a place more faithfully than the official record preserves the facts. And the legend says that Wallace came to Loudoun Hill. According to that tradition, an English force was moving along the road below the hill in 1296. Its commander is named as Fenwick. The story says Fenwick had killed Wallace's father and that Wallace came to this ground with vengeance in his heart. Whether this is true, we cannot say. Historic caution matters. The sources are late, the details shift. Some historians suspect that elements of Bruce's later and better attested victory at Loudoun Hill may have been drawn backwards into Wallace's story by patriotic memory. And yet, the story has endured. It has endured because it fits the place. The road below the hill narrows. The ground around it complicates movement. Bog, slope, and route meet in a way that favours those who know the land over those who merely pass through it. A force confident in numbers and equipment could find itself suddenly constrained. A smaller force, hidden, patient, familiar with every fold of the ground, could make the land itself an ally. This, at least, is what the tradition remembers. Wallace, with a small company, waiting near the place where the road could be struck. The English approaching. Horses moving heavily over ground that would not let them spread. A sudden attack from the side. Confusion. Shouting. Steel. Panic. The kind of violence that lasts only minutes in real time, but centuries in memory. Imagine the moment before the ambush. That is where the real darkness lies. Not in the clash itself, not yet, but in the waiting. Men crouched or standing in cover, breathing hard, trying to keep still. Someone's hand tightening around a weapon. Someone swallowing against a dry throat. Someone thinking of his family. Someone thinking of nothing at all, because fear has narrowed the world to the next breath. The hill above them, silent. The road below. Approaching sound. Hooves. Harness. Men talking as men talk when they do not know they are being watched. Then the choice. Now. And history, or legend, opens its mouth. There is a monument at the foot of Loudoun Hill now, the Spirit of Scotland, a 5-metre steel silhouette of Wallace created by Richard Price and unveiled in 2004. It stands not as a literal portrait, because no true portrait of Wallace survives, but as a shape, a presence, a dark human outline facing the road and the moor. That is fitting. Wallace himself has become a silhouette in Scottish memory, solid in outline, fierce in profile, full of gaps when examined closely. The more we try to see the exact face, the more the face withdraws. But the shape remains. Resistance. Not always clean, not always comfortable, not always historically tidy. But there. A refusal. The tradition of Wallace at Loudoun Hill tells us something important, even if some of its details cannot be proven. It tells us that people needed this hill to hold a story of resistance before kings and formal armies took the stage. They needed a place where a smaller force could strike a larger one. A place where local knowledge could overcome imperial confidence. A place where the land itself seemed to side with the hunted. Perhaps that is why the story stayed. Because whether Wallace fought exactly as Blind Harry tells it or not, the hill was waiting for that kind of story. It had the right shape, it had the right road, it had the right darkness. and Scotland, wounded and uncertain, needed to believe that the ground beneath its feet could still be used against those who came to own it. Chapter 4. The Bruce, a kingdom won on boggy ground. 11 years after Wallace's death, Robert the Bruce came to Loudoun Hill. He came in very different circumstances. Wallace had lived and died as an outlaw hero, a figure of defiance whose authority came from action and memory. Bruce came as a king. But in the spring of 1307, kingship had not made him safe. It had made him hunted. Robert Bruce had seized the crown in a country already torn apart by occupation, divided loyalties, private feuds, rival claims, and the brutal intelligence of Edward I of England. His coronation at Scone in 1306 had been followed almost immediately by disaster. At Methven, Bruce's army was surprised and shattered. He escaped, but only just. His supporters were captured and executed. His enemies multiplied. His family suffered terribly. Women of his household were imprisoned and displayed. His daughter, still a child, was held in the Tower of London. Those who chose him paid dearly for the choice. For a time, Bruce had almost nothing. Not the secure authority of a king, not the safety of a lord, not the advantage of numbers. Only a name, a claim, a narrowing circle of loyal followers, and a refusal to let the story end where his enemies expected it to end. There is a legend, of course, that during his lowest period, Bruce watched a spider attempt again and again to build its web, failing and trying, until at last it succeeded. Whether that happened in the literal way the story tells it is less important than why the story has lasted. It gives a shape to endurance. It says that failure is not always final. It says that a defeated man may still be dangerous if he has not accepted the meaning of defeat. By 1307, Bruce had returned to the mainland and begun to change the rhythm of the war. He was not trying to meet English power in the open on English terms. He was learning, or remembering, that Scotland's strength lay partly in refusing the battlefield his enemies expected. Woods, passes, hills, bogs, narrow places, ground that punished confidence. At Glentrool, he used height and terrain to harass and defeat an English force moving through difficult ground. Then came Loudoun Hill. Aymer de Valence, Earl of Pembroke, was not a fool. He had already defeated Bruce at Methven. He was an experienced commander, loyal to Edward, personally invested in the struggle, and able to bring a larger, better-equipped force into the field. When he came north again, he did so with the confidence of a man who had beaten his opponent before. Bruce understood that confidence. More importantly, he understood where it could be made useless. He arrived at Loudoun Hill before de Valence and examined the ground. This matters. It is not a romantic detail. It is the hinge of the entire battle. The plain below the hill was bordered by wet and difficult ground. The road gave access, but also constraint. The morasses on either side limited cavalry movement. A large force might approach with all the appearance of strength and still be unable to bring that strength properly to bear. Bruce saw what the ground offered. Then he altered it. He ordered ditches cut inward from the edges of the mosses, narrowing the usable approach still further. He created gaps, guarded by dismounted spearmen. He made the route smaller. He forced the English to come at him through a shape he had prepared. This was not simply courage. Courage alone would not have been enough. This was intelligence under pressure. This was desperation disciplined into design. This was a hunted king becoming a commander again. On the 10th of May, 1307, de Valence advanced. The English outnumbered the Scots. The sources give figures, as medieval sources often do, and the figures may be exaggerated, but the essential point is not in doubt. Bruce faced a larger force. The English had cavalry, armour, banners, the weight of a military machine that had crushed better-positioned men than Bruce. They came expecting force to settle the matter. But force must move through ground, and the ground had been taught what to do. The horses advanced into narrowing space. The ditches and bogs denied them freedom. The formations compressed. The advantage of speed and weight diminished with every yard. Cavalry, which in open ground could be terrifying, became vulnerable where it could not manoeuvre. The Scots held. Pikes levelled. Feet planted. Men waiting behind work they had dug with their own hands. Then the impact. Not clean, not cinematic, not the elegant sweep of battle paintings. Real battle is noise, pressure, fear, mud, breath, screams, confusion, bodies pressed too close to move properly, spears splintering, horses injured, men trying to pull back and unable to, the front ranks discovering too late that the road has become a trap. The English attack faltered, Bruce's men pressed, the line broke, and de Valence fled. How many died, the surviving sources do not securely tell us. Enough fell, and enough fled for the effect to be unmistakable. The man who had defeated Bruce at Methven had now been defeated by him at Loudoun Hill. The hunted king had not merely survived, he had chosen his ground, prepared it, stood on it, and won. There are moments in history that become larger than their immediate military scale. Loudoun Hill was one of them. It was not Bannockburn. It did not end the war. It did not secure the kingdom in a single stroke. But it changed the emotional weather. It showed that Bruce was not finished. It showed that Edward's commanders could be beaten. It gave the wavering a reason to reconsider. It gave the faithful a reason to remain faithful. It gave Bruce himself the one thing a nearly ruined cause needs more than anything else. Proof. Proof that the story was not over. 3 days later, Bruce defeated another English force. 2 months later, Edward I died at Berg by Sands, just south of the Scottish border, still trying to bring his power north against the king he had failed to crush. The hammer of the Scots did not reach Scotland. His son would come later, and 7 years after Loudoun Hill, on another field chosen with care, Bruce would face the power of England at Bannockburn and break it in front of the watching world. But before Bannockburn, there was this. Boggy ground, ditches cut by desperate men, a volcanic hill standing above the road, a king who had lost almost everything and found, in the shape of the land, a way back toward his kingdom. There is no towering monument to Bruce at Loudoun Hill, nothing as visually dominant as the steel Wallace at the foot of the hill. Only an engraved stone near the summit marks the victory. Somehow, that feels fitting. Bruce's genius at Loudoun Hill was not theatrical, it was practical. He read the ground, he prepared, he waited. He used what was there. The hill did not need to shout his name. It had already done its work. Chapter 5. The Witch's Hill. Trial, Fear, and the Devil on the Moor. Nearly 3 centuries after Bruce's victory, Loudoun Hill appeared in a very different kind of record. Not a chronicle of battle, not a military account, not a story of kings and cavalry and prepared ground. A witch trial. In 1605, during the reign of James VI of Scotland, a man named Patrick Lowry was tried for witchcraft. James was a king with a deep and active interest in witchcraft, demonology, and the perceived war between godly order and supernatural threat. He had written on the subject himself. His Scotland was a place where fear, theology, law, Illness, misfortune, neighbourly grievance and state power could combine with lethal results. We must be careful in this chapter. We are not listening here to reliable accounts of supernatural events. We are listening to the language of accusation, the language of fear, the language of courts and communities trying to explain suffering. When a cow failed to give milk, when a child sickened, when a harvest failed, when a quarrel lingered, when a healer was trusted by some and suspected by others, early modern Scotland had a framework ready to receive the anxiety. Witchcraft could turn ordinary misfortune into a story with a villain. It could give pain a face. And once that face was named, the machinery of law could begin to move. Patrick Lowry's case drew Loudoun Hill into that machinery.
The surviving records connect him to accusations that meetings took place at Loudoun Hill, where Satan was said to appear in the likeness of a woman, a devilish spirit associated in the testimony with the name Helen McBroom. The case also touched other places in Ayrshire, including Irvine Shaw, and included claims about harm to cattle around Beltane, the old May fire festival that had long carried associations with seasonal turning and boundary crossing. It is dark material. Not because it proves that something diabolical happened on the moor, but because it proves that people believed, feared, accused, testified, and condemned. Imagine the hill in that period. Not the tourist hill, not the history hill, not the place framed by interpretation boards and online maps, a real hill in a frightened landscape. The Reformation had remade religious life, but older habits of thought did not disappear simply because doctrine changed. People still understood the world as layered with danger. God watched, the devil watched. Spirits, charms, curses, blessings, omens, signs. These things were not decorative folklore to the people who lived with them. They were part of the structure of reality. And Loudoun Hill, with its abrupt shape and ancient name and commanding presence, was exactly the kind of place where fear could gather. If you were going to imagine a meeting with the devil, you would not choose a dull field. You would choose a threshold, a place apart, a place already marked by older significance, a place where the road passes below and the wind moves over the wet ground and the hill stands above it all like a witness that refuses to speak. This is one of the strange things about witch trial records. They often preserve, beneath their cruelty and theology, fragments of older landscapes of meaning. They tell us where people were afraid. They tell us where people believed the ordinary world thinned. They tell us which places had a reputation strong enough to carry a charge of supernatural gathering. Loudoun Hill had that reputation. It was already a place of power in the local mind. The court records did not create that. They used it. Patrick Lowry was found guilty and sentenced to death by strangling and burning. That is the historical fact that must not be lost beneath the atmosphere. Behind every witch story is a human being, a body, a name, a voice that did not survive except through the record of accusation. The temptation in dark narration is to lean into the image of witches on the hill, to make the night theatrical, to let Satan stride across the moor because it is vivid and frightening and easy to picture. But the deeper horror is quieter. It is the knowledge that fear can become law, that communities can decide someone carries the blame for what hurts them, that a hill can be turned into evidence, that the old sense of Loudoun as a threshold place, a charged place, a place where something other might be present, could be drawn into a system of punishment from which there was no mercy. The hill absorbed this too, as it had absorbed battle, as it had absorbed prayer, as it had absorbed the footfalls of soldiers and farmers and watchers and accused people who may have looked toward it in fear. The devil of the 1605 record is long gone, if he was ever there. the fear remains easier to believe in. Fear has always been good at surviving. And Loudoun Hill, dark against the moor, has always been good at giving fear a place to stand. Chapter 6. The Killing Times, Covenanters and Bloody Clavers. 74 years after the Patrick Lowry witch trial, Loudoun Hill became the gathering place for another act the authorities considered dangerous. This time, the danger was prayer. On the 1st of June, 1679, a large conventicle gathered near Loudoun Hill. A conventicle was an outdoor religious service, and in Scotland at that time, outdoor religious services could be illegal, especially when they belonged to the world of Presbyterian dissent and covenanting resistance. To understand why people would risk their lives to stand on open moorland and listen to a sermon, we have to understand that this was not simply a matter of personal religious preference. It was about authority, conscience, the right to worship without the imposed structures of bishops and royal control. The Covenanters believed that Christ, not the king, was the head of the church. That belief in 17th century Scotland could become a death sentence. The restored Stuart monarchy imposed increasingly strict control over religious nonconformity. Ministers were removed, fines were issued, homes were searched. People who refused to attend approved services or who gathered in unauthorised meetings could be punished. Government troops moved through the southwest, where covenanting support ran deep. And still the people gathered. They came over rough ground, from farms, from villages, from scattered households where the talk would have been low and careful in the days before. They brought children sometimes. They brought food. They brought Bibles. They brought weapons. Because faith had become a thing that might need defending with metal in the hand. Try to imagine that morning near Loudoun Hill, not as a painting, not as a heroic tableau, as a weather, breath, wet grass, uneasy glances, people gathering in ones and twos and small groups, the way people gather when they know they are watched. Sentries posted, men scanning the road, women listening for distant hoofbeats while pretending not to listen. The preacher raising his voice into the open air because there were no walls to hold the sound. The preacher was Thomas Douglas. Tradition says he was in the middle of his sermon when word came that government dragoons were approaching under John Graham of Claverhouse. Claverhouse. To some, Bonnie Dundee. To others, bloody Clavers. A soldier, a royalist, an enforcer, a man whose name would be remembered with admiration by one tradition and hatred by another. The Southwest knew him as the face of state power on horseback. The story says Douglas broke off his sermon with words that became famous. "You have got the theory. Now for the practice." Whether the exact phrase was spoken exactly so, tradition has kept it because it captures the truth of the moment. A sermon had become a battlefield. The armed Covenanters moved east from the hill toward Drumclog, choosing ground that worked against cavalry. This is the echo that gives the Loudoun Hill landscape its strange historical power. Again, boggy ground. Again, men on foot facing mounted force. Again, local knowledge and chosen terrain turning weakness into strength. Claverhouse arrived expecting to suppress a conventicle. He found men ready to fight. The government force was mounted and professional, but the ground did not favour it. A ditch and marshy terrain stood between the two sides. Skirmishing began. The Covenanters, though less experienced and less formally equipped, were not the helpless crowd later imagination sometimes makes them. Many carried muskets. Others carried scythes, pitchforks, and improvised weapons. They had come prepared for trouble, and trouble had found them. At the decisive moment, the Covenanter force charged, across the wet ground, into the smoke, toward men who represented everything they believed had been set against their conscience. The government troops were overwhelmed and routed. Claverhouse escaped, wounded in pride if not fatally in body, his force broken, his reputation stained by a defeat delivered by the very people he had come to scatter. The losses were not enormous by the standards of great battles, but numbers are not the only measure of meaning. The government dead mattered. The Covenanter dead mattered. The shock mattered. The news mattered. For a brief time, the victory at Drumclog made the impossible feel possible. People came to the cause. Hope swelled. The government realised it was facing not a nuisance, but a rising. 3 weeks later, at Bothwell Bridge, that hope was crushed by a much larger government force. The killing and persecution continued, but Drumclog remained. It entered story, sermon, song, argument, memory. Sir Walter Scott would later draw on it in Old Mortality, carrying the conflict into the imagination of a wider public. The names of Claverhouse and the Covenanters would continue to divide sympathies long after the men themselves were dust. This is the thing about conscience. It is rarely tidy. The Covenanters were not simple saints. They could be hard, severe, uncompromising. Their own internal divisions were fierce. Their theology could be stern. Their politics could be dangerous. But many of them were also ordinary people who believed that something sacred was being taken from them, and that to yield would be to betray not an opinion, but God. So they stood on moorland. They listened to a sermon they might die for. And when the soldiers came, they moved from theory into practice. Loudoun Hill watched that too, watched the gathering, watched the movement east, watched the old lesson return yet again, that wet ground can defeat horses, that ordinary people, pressed hard enough, can become dangerous, that a place of prayer can become a place of war in the length of a single sentence. Chapter 7. The Clearances, the Land Emptied. At the foot of Loudoun Hill, there are the ghost outlines of farmsteads. You can see them if you know what you are looking for. A faint rectangle where walls once stood. A slight difference in the colour of vegetation. A low rise that does not quite belong to the natural shape of the ground. The memory of a doorway, the hint of a byre. The place where smoke once rose and then stopped rising. The landscape remembers them even when almost everyone else has forgotten. When people speak of the Scottish clearances, they usually mean the Highland clearances, the forced eviction of communities from the glens and islands in the 18th and 19th centuries, often to make way for sheep, profit, improvement, and the brutal arithmetic of land ownership. That story has been told with anger and grief, and rightly so. But the lowlands changed too. Ayrshire changed. Lanarkshire changed. The southwest changed. Not always in the same dramatic pattern. Not always with burning roofs and mass eviction scenes that lend themselves to the tragic imagination. Sometimes the process was quieter, which does not mean kinder. Leases ended. Small farms were joined into larger units. Agricultural improvement brought new efficiencies and old exclusions. Families who had worked a place for generations found that the future no longer had room for them. The land did not need to hate them. It simply stopped requiring them. That can be its own kind of cruelty. Think of the families around Loudoun Hill. People who knew the hill not as a national symbol, not as a battlefield, not as a subject for historians, but as part of the daily furniture of life. It was what you saw from the door in the morning. It was the shape beyond the field. It told you weather. It marked direction. It was simply there, so constantly there that perhaps you forgot, some days, to notice it. Children grew up beneath it. They learned the wet places. They learned the safe paths. They learned which animals strayed and where. They learned stories from older voices at firesides: Wallace, Bruce, Covenanters, witches, soldiers, ghosts, warnings, names. Then the world shifted. Not suddenly, perhaps, not in a single dramatic day, but through decisions made elsewhere, through rent, through law, through estate management, through the language of improvement, which can sound so reasonable until you ask who is being improved out of existence. Some left for industrial towns, Kilmarnock, Glasgow, Ayr, the places where work might be found if the countryside had no more room for you. Some went further, Canada, Australia, America, where a person could begin again if beginning again did not break them first. And the farmsteads remained for a while, a roof sagging, a wall leaning, a track grassing over, a door gone, a hearth cold. Then the weather took its share, the moor took its share, time took the rest. It is tempting to make every ruin into a precise story, to say this family left in this year for this reason with these words spoken at the door. Sometimes records allow that, often they do not. So we must be honest. Not every abandoned stone at the foot of Loudoun Hill can be tied neatly to a single eviction notice or a single act of removal. But the broader truth remains. This landscape, like so much of lowland Scotland, was reshaped by improvement, consolidation, and economic pressure. People who had belonged to the land in one way were replaced by systems that belonged to profit in another. The old rural world thinned. Names moved off maps. Houses became outlines. Fields forgot the hands that had known them. The hill remained. That is the sorrow of places like this. They preserve what they cannot save. Loudoun Hill could watch families leave, but it could not call them back. It could stand as the fixed point in their lives, but it could not keep their lives from being altered by forces far beyond the valley. Perhaps some of those who left turned once at the road and looked back. Perhaps they saw the hill dark against the sky and understood that they were leaving more than a house. They were leaving a horizon. Today, when walkers pass those faint remains, they may be thinking of Bruce or Wallace. They may be looking for photographs of the hill. They may not notice the old farmsteads at all. But the ground notices. The hill notices, if we allow ourselves that language. It has always watched not only the great events, the battles and trials and public memories, but also the small endings. A family gone. A door closed for the last time. A hearth left cold. A name no longer spoken locally. History is not only made by kings. Sometimes it is made by silence entering a house and staying there.
Chapter 8. The God in the Hill, Lugus and the Old Religion. Now let us speak of something older and more difficult. The name Loudoun has been linked by scholars to older Celtic forms, perhaps to Lugudunon, the fort of Lugus. The same element appears in place names across the Celtic world, carrying the memory of a deity whose exact nature cannot now be fully recovered, but whose presence was once widespread and powerful. Lugus. In later Irish tradition, Lu appears as a god of many skills: light, craft, warfare, poetry, kingship, mastery, the harvest, and the ability to move between categories that ordinary beings cannot cross so easily. He is not a small god. He is not a simple god. He belongs to the old world of layered powers, where a deity could be warrior, artisan, ruler, and threshold keeper all at once. The Gaelic festival of Lunastal, connected with harvest and seasonal turning, preserves his name in another form.
The year moves through light toward darkness. The first fruits are gathered. The old rhythms of earth and sky are marked, and somewhere in the name Loudoun, perhaps, the memory of Lugus remains compressed. We cannot prove every detail we might wish to prove. Ancient religion in this part of Scotland was not written down by those who practiced it. It lived in voice, ritual, season, place, body, memory, and story. Much of it is gone. Much of what we think we know comes through later tradition, comparison, place names, archaeology, and the accounts of outsiders. So again, we must be careful. Care does not diminish the mystery, it deepens it. What does it mean for a hill to carry the name of a god long after belief has changed? Place names are among the most patient forms of memory human beings possess. They survive conquest, language shift, religious transformation, migration, forgetting. People can speak a name every day without knowing what they are preserving. A farmer may say it while describing a field. A child may say it while asking where a road goes. A cartographer may write it neatly on a map. A driver may see it on a sign and pass without a thought. But the old word remains under the modern mouth. That is a kind of haunting. Not ghosts in white shapes. Not voices in ruined rooms. A deeper haunting. A memory embedded so thoroughly in ordinary language that nobody notices it is still there. Loudoun. Perhaps the fort of Lugus. Perhaps the hill of a threshold god. Perhaps a name that has carried, across centuries of Christianization, Reformation, war, agriculture, improvement, roads, railways and cars, the faint outline of an older sacred geography. If the association with Lugus is right, or even partly right, then the later history of Loudoun Hill takes on a strange resonance. A threshold god associated with light and passage. A hill standing between Ayrshire and the Clyde Valley. A road passing below it. A fort on its slopes. A Roman presence near it. A remembered ambush. A king's turning point. A witch trial landscape. An illegal gathering of worshippers. A battlefield of conscience. Again and again, the hill becomes a place of crossing, between defeat and resistance, between fear and action, between private belief and public consequence, between the living and the dead, between one Scotland and another. I am not asking you to believe that Lugus still stands on Loudoun Hill. I am asking you to notice that human beings have treated this place as if something stands there. Not always consciously, not always reverently, sometimes violently, sometimes fearfully, sometimes with no language beyond the practical. But the pattern is there. People come to this hill when something is at stake. They build, they watch, they fight, they pray, they accuse, they remember, they return. And the hill receives all of it without explanation. The old gods do not need to be believed in to leave marks. A god can disappear from worship and remain in a name. A ritual can be forgotten and remain in the timing of a fair. A sacred place can become a battlefield, then a tourist stop, then a line on a walking route, and still carry something that cannot be reduced to any of those things. Perhaps this is what people mean when they say a place has atmosphere. They mean that too many meanings have gathered there. Too much has happened. Too many people have looked up. Too many fears and hopes have been placed into the same ground. Loudoun Hill is not only a geological feature, it is an archive. Not of paper, not of ink, of attention. And attention, repeated across centuries, becomes a form of power. Chapter 9. The Dead on the Moorland. Ghosts of 3 Battles. Three stories of violence gather around Loudoun Hill. Wallace's remembered ambush, Bruce's documented victory, the Covenanters' stand at Drumclog. Historians will, rightly, separate them. They differ in evidence, scale, context, and certainty.
Wallace's encounter belongs largely to tradition and Blind Harry's later telling. Bruce's battle in 1307 is the core historical event. Drumclog lies nearby, east of the hill, connected by landscape, memory, and the gathering that began near Loudoun before moving towards the chosen ground. But places do not always remember with the neatness of historians. Local memory gathers, it layers. It lets events speak to one another across centuries. At Loudoun Hill, the repeated pattern is hard to ignore. Smaller forces, larger forces, wet ground, mounted power frustrated, people who know the landscape using it against those who underestimate it. Again and again, the moorland teaches the same lesson. Again and again, men die learning it. What happens to battlefield dead? In great national memory, they become numbers, casualties, losses, sometimes honoured, sometimes ignored, depending on who won, who wrote, and who had a stone placed in the ground. In reality, they become bodies. Heavy, awkward, suddenly silent. Men who had names in the morning and became problems by evening. Someone must move them. Someone must bury them. Someone must strip useful items from them. Someone must look away. Someone must remember or choose not to remember. For the 1307 battle, the sources do not securely tell us the numbers lost. There were casualties. The descriptions suggest wounds, broken attacks, men and horses struck by spears, confusion and retreat. The bodies may have been buried near where they fell, or moved by locals, or lost in the wet ground and the later disturbances of centuries. The moor keeps what it is given. For Drumclog, the losses were recorded more clearly, though still with the variations of early modern account. Government soldiers fell, some Covenanters fell, others died as the retreat moved towards Strathaven. Graves and memorials anchor parts of that story, but even a marked grave is only the visible point of a much wider grief. And around Wallace's remembered fight, the dead belong more to legend than record. Yet the legend has its own dead. Men killed in the telling, men whose names never mattered to the story because the story needed Wallace, Fenwick, vengeance, resistance, not the ordinary bodies lying in the aftermath. Moorland is good at making the dead feel close. Mist rises low, sound travels strangely, light changes quickly. A figure at distance can be a fence post, a person, a memory, or nothing at all until you are close enough to know. On autumn evenings, when the air cools and the wet ground exhales, the landscape east of Loudoun Hill can feel as if it has not quite settled. The road is there, the fields are there, the modern world is close, but the old weather moves across it all, and the mind begins to understand why earlier generations found ghosts in places like this. There are old accounts from many parts of Britain and Ireland of corpse candles and will-o'-the-wisps, lights moving over marsh or grave ground, small, cold flames seen where no flame should be. Modern explanations reach for marsh gas, reflected light, bioluminescence, eye tricks, mist, distance, and the brain's hunger for pattern. Earlier generations reached for the dead. They were not necessarily foolish to do so. If you live in a landscape where men have died violently, where stories of battles are told and retold, where the ground is wet enough to shine strangely in fading light, where grief has outlived the people who first felt it, then a light in the mist will not be only a physical event. It will be a message, or a warning, or a soul, or the mind giving shape to something the heart already knows. This ground is not empty.
I do not think we need to believe that armed men still walk the moor at Loudoun Hill. We do not need to imagine Wallace's dead rising, or Bruce's enemies wandering, or Covenanters crossing the marsh forever with muskets in their hands. The truth is quieter and perhaps more unsettling. Places of violence do not have to be haunted in order to be changed. A battlefield is altered by what happens there. Not chemically, not always visibly, but in the human field of meaning. We know what happened, and because we know, the air feels different. The ground becomes charged not by ghosts, but by attention, by remembrance, by the knowledge that human beings once reached the end of themselves in that place. That is enough. It is enough to make silence feel occupied. It is enough to make mist feel intentional. It is enough to make a walker pause for reasons they cannot explain. The dead on the moorland do not need to rise. They have already entered the place. And Loudoun Hill, as always, keeps the shape of what it has seen.
Chapter 10. The Steel Ghost, Wallace Watching. In September 2004, a 5-metre steel silhouette was placed at the foot of Loudoun Hill. It was created by the local artist Richard Price and is known as the Spirit of Scotland. It shows William Wallace, or rather, it shows the idea of William Wallace. A human outline cut from steel. Tall, still, sword-bearing, facing outward across the landscape associated with the old story of resistance. It is not a portrait. That is important. There are no reliable portraits of Wallace. We do not know the exact shape of his face. We do not know the line of his mouth, the set of his eyes, the texture of his ordinary expression when he was not being turned into symbol. The man himself is lost to us in most of the ways a person can be lost. But the outline remains. And perhaps outline is exactly the right language for Wallace. Solid from a distance, difficult up close. A figure made partly of history and partly of need. The monument understands that. It does not try to give us a face we cannot know. It gives us a presence. There is something strangely effective about a silhouette. A statue in full detail invites inspection. You look at the face, the clothing, the pose, the accuracy or inaccuracy of the costume. You judge the artist's choices. You decide whether it looks right. A silhouette asks something else of you. It asks you to complete it. Your own imagination moves into the blankness. The figure becomes not only Wallace, but every idea you have inherited about Wallace. Resistance, violence, martyrdom, defiance, patriotism, revenge, sacrifice, story. At Loudoun Hill, with the real hill rising behind it, the steel figure gains power from what it does not show. Move around it and the body thins to a line. From one angle it dominates. From another it almost disappears. That too feels right. Legend is like that. Face it directly and it can seem enormous. Shift position and you see how narrow the evidence can be. Move again and the shape returns, because human beings do not live by evidence alone. We live by meaning, and meaning has its own gravity. Visitors often notice how strangely alive the sculpture can feel at dusk. Not alive in the literal sense, alive in the way steel can seem to breathe when wind moves around it and the light changes. Alive because the shadow lengthens. Alive because the human shape, simplified to its essentials, awakens the part of the mind that is always looking for another person in the landscape. A dark figure near a dark hill. A watcher below a watcher. The sculpture faces outward, but it also seems to belong to the hill behind it, as if the hill has finally cast one of its memories forward into human form. This is what memorials do when they work. They do not merely tell us that something happened, they let the happening remain present enough to trouble us. The spirit of Scotland is not subtle in theme, but it is subtle in effect. It does not need to shout.
Its force comes from stillness, from outline, from the decision to make Wallace less a man in costume than a gap cut into the present through which the past can be seen. There is a danger with monuments. They can simplify. They can harden. They can make history seem cleaner than it was, less conflicted, more useful to whoever is doing the remembering. Wallace has been used by many Scotlands for many purposes. Hero, martyr, rebel, nationalist icon, cinematic warrior, local legend, inconvenient historical problem. But at Loudoun Hill, the monument has the advantage of being placed in a landscape that resists simplification. The hill complicates everything. It reminds us that Wallace is not the only story here. Bruce stands behind him in the ground. The Covenanters stand nearby in memory. The accused of witchcraft, the farm families, the Roman soldiers, the Iron Age watchers, the unnamed dead. All of them press against the same place.
So the steel ghost of Wallace does not own Loudoun Hill. It joins the others. Another watcher, another layer, another human attempt to say, remember this. And the hill, which has never needed steel to remember anything, receives the monument without comment. At night, when the road quietens and the wind comes across the moor, the figure becomes a darker darkness at the foot of a greater dark. A man made of steel, a hill made of fire, a silence made of everything that has happened here. Chapter 11. The Road Past the Hill. Most ancient places survive by becoming remote. They withdraw to hilltops, islands, ruins, forests, locked estates, or places that require effort to reach. They become destinations. You decide to go there. You prepare. You walk. You climb. You cross a threshold knowingly. Loudoun Hill has done something stranger. It has remained visible from an ordinary road.
The A71 passes below it, carrying commuters, lorries, cyclists, families, delivery vans, people late for appointments, people thinking about shopping lists, people arguing quietly in cars, people listening to the radio, people passing through with no intention of entering history. And then the hill appears, abruptly. It does not care what you are thinking about. It interrupts, a shape on the edge of the everyday, a volcanic fact beside a modern route, a reminder that the present is often much thinner than we pretend. You can drive past Loudoun Hill without stopping, of course. Most people do. Life is busy. Roads are made for passing. The hill becomes one of those familiar landmarks that the eye registers almost without thought. There it is, still there. And yet, even from a moving car, it does something. It draws attention. A child in the back seat may ask what it is. A local may use it as a marker without thinking. Turn before the hill, past the hill, near the hill. The hill becomes part of ordinary navigation, which is another way places enter the body. You do not have to visit a place formally for it to shape you. Sometimes it is enough to pass it all your life. At night, the road changes the hill's mood. Headlights move across the lower ground and vanish. Red tail lights slide away toward Darvel or Strathaven. Rain catches in the beams and turns briefly silver. The road surface shines. The verges darken. Then each car passes, and for a moment after it has gone, the darkness seems deeper than before. The hill remains. It is not lit like a monument. It is not staged. It does not ask to be photographed. It simply occupies the dark. There are people who know this hill only as a night shape glimpsed from the road. People who have never climbed it, never read its history,
never stood beside the Wallace monument, never traced the battlefield in their mind. And still, some part of them may feel that the place is not ordinary. This matters, because history is not only kept by historians, plaques, books, and battlefield inventories. It is kept by repeated noticing, by the driver who sees the shape every winter evening, by the walker who stops without knowing why, by the photographer who waits for the right light, by the local child who grows up with the hill as a fixed point and only later learns what happened beneath it, by the person who passes it in grief, or worry, or tiredness, and feels for 1 second that their own life is small beside something vast, and is comforted, rather than diminished, by that. There is a particular loneliness to roads at night in the Scottish countryside. Not emptiness exactly, more the sense that the human world has narrowed to beams of light and engine noise, while everything beyond the verge has returned to itself. Fields are no longer fields, but darkness. Hills are no longer scenic, but presences. Trees are no longer shapes, but masses. The mind becomes older in such places. It listens for danger, even when danger is unlikely. Loudoun Hill, seen in that condition, belongs not to tourism, but to instinct. You understand why people watched from it. You understand why people gathered near it. You understand why stories attached to it. You understand why, in an earlier century, a place like this could hold gods, devils, armies, prayers, and the dead without contradiction. Because at night, contradiction loosens. The modern road and the ancient hill exist together. The car passes. The hill stays. The phone signal comes and goes. The old ground remains beneath it. A person can be thinking of invoices, school runs, hospital appointments, job interviews, messages they have not answered, and still look up, just once, and feel the pressure of everything that came before. That is one of Loudoun Hill's quiet powers. It does not require belief. It requires only attention. There are places we seek out because they are famous. There are places we inherit because we live near them. And there are places that keep entering our lives sideways, from the edge of the road, from the corner of the eye, until one day we realize they have been with us for years. Loudoun Hill is such a place. A landmark, a witness, a dark shape beside an ordinary road. It stands there while people pass in both directions, carrying the concerns of the day past the concerns of centuries. And perhaps that is the final lesson of the road. We are always passing the past, usually quickly, usually distracted, often without gratitude. But the past does not move at our speed. It stands where it happened, waiting for us to notice. Epilogue. The Hill Tonight. It is night now on the moorland east of Darvel. The A71 is quieter than it was. The few cars that pass move quickly, their headlights sweeping across the wet verge and then gone, leaving the darkness more complete than before. Somewhere below the road, the River Irvine moves through the valley, following the line it has followed since water first found a path through the land after the ice. And above the road, above the moorland, above the ghost outlines of abandoned farmsteads and the boggy ground where history gathered again and again, the hill is there. Loudoun Hill. It is very dark at its summit tonight. No light is near enough to soften it. It is simply a mass against the sky, a shape the stars do not occupy, a density of dark against the comparative lightness of the night above it. If you stand at the foot of the Spirit of Scotland sculpture and look up, you are standing in a place where stories overlap so densely that the ground almost seems unable to hold them all. Somewhere near here, tradition places Wallace's resistance. Somewhere near here, Bruce prepared the ground that helped return him to the path of kingship. Somewhere near here,
People gathered for worship and then moved toward Drumclog, where prayer became battle. Somewhere in the records, this hill is drawn into the terrible machinery of a witch trial. Somewhere in the name, perhaps, the memory of an older god remains. Somewhere in the moor, the outlines of homes remember people who left and did not return. The hill does not advertise any of this. It does not need to. It simply stands. The battles are over. The Covenanters are in their graves. The witch trial records sit in archives. The Roman road has become in part the line of modern travel. The old farms have thinned into marks on the ground. The Wallace monument holds its steel silence below the hill. The engraved stone for Bruce waits near the summit. The descendants of those who once lived here may be farming in Ontario, working in Melbourne, walking through Glasgow, sitting in houses not knowing that somewhere in East Ayrshire a hill still holds the shape of the world their people left behind. That is how history often works. It does not vanish. It becomes unevenly remembered. One thing becomes a monument, another becomes a footnote, another becomes a rumour, another becomes a field name, another becomes silence. Loudoun Hill holds them all with the same dark patience. Perhaps this is why the hill feels the way it does to people who stand at its foot, because it places our own lives in proportion, not to belittle them, not to make them meaningless, but to remind us that every fear, every act of courage, every grief, every refusal, every leaving, every home, every prayer, every argument with power, every name spoken and forgotten, belongs to a story wider than itself. The hill has seen kings nearly broken. It has seen ordinary people become dangerous because conscience required it. It has seen fear turn neighbours into accusers. It has seen families leave land they thought would always know them. It has seen roads change and languages change and countries change their shape around it. And still it stands. Not comforting exactly, but steady. If you go to Loudoun Hill, go quietly. Not because the place is fragile. It is not fragile. It has endured fire, ice, weather, war, prayer, accusation, abandonment, traffic, memory, and forgetting. Go quietly because some places do not need us to fill them with our own noise. Stand near the road and look up. Let the hill be larger than your explanation of it. Notice the slope, notice the wet ground. Notice the way the road passes below. Notice the way the monument watches outward while the hill watches everything. Then imagine the people who have stood there before you. The Iron Age watcher scanning the valley. The Roman soldier far from home. The man in Wallace's company waiting for the signal. Bruce studying the ground with everything at stake. The accused person whose name entered a record they would never escape. The Covenanter listening for hoofbeats during a sermon. The farmer closing a door for the last time. The modern driver glancing up for half a second and feeling something they cannot name. All of them are gone. You will go too. That is not meant to frighten you. It is simply the truth that old places tell without malice. We pass. The hill remains. And perhaps, in the end, that is why places like Loudoun Hill matter. They remind us that endurance is not the same as indifference. Stone may not care as we care. A hill may not remember as we remember. The land may not grieve in any human way, but still something is held. In names, in paths, in weathered banks, in roads, in monuments, in stories told by people who were told by people who were told by people before them. Something passes forward. Not perfectly, never perfectly, but enough. Enough for a hill in East Ayrshire to rise from the moorland and still make people look twice. Enough for an ordinary road to pass through extraordinary memory. enough for us, tonight, to stand in the dark and listen. Thank you for watching, and for spending this quiet time with Loudoun Hill. Some places do not need to shout to be remembered. They simply stand. They hold the weather, the silence, the old stories, and the footsteps of those who came before us. If this journey gave you a moment of stillness, reflection, or connection, please consider liking the video, subscribing to Quietly Reflective, and sharing it with someone who may enjoy Scotland's history, folklore, and quieter places. Take care of yourself. Move gently into the rest of your evening. And wherever you are tonight, may you find a little peace in the quiet. Until next time, quiet thoughts for a noisy world.